Here we go. All right, good evening. Hope all of you are well. Tonight we're learning Maseches Rosh Hashana Daf Chav Tes, but due to some significant banter on Shabbos, Baruch Hashem, all hovering around Torah, we didn't finish Kav Ches and Beis. We're starting 2/3 of the way down at the last of the short lines at the words Umenat Timra. Before we discuss that, I just wanted to share what the game plan is for the Siyum. The Siyum for Maseches Rosh Hashana will fall out on Shabbos, Amir Hashem. So the game plan is to overlearn a little bit between now and then, so that on Shabbos, on Daf Lamed Hey, which is only one part of one Amud, we'll have just a couple of lines left, maybe the last 8 lines or so. We'll do a Siyum in Shul immediately after davening, and then we'll go into a deluxe Kiddush with rolls for those who would like to wash. That way we can have a Suda Lifnei Am Va'ida, a little bit more robust than usual, and nobody has to pay for it because Monarch has sponsored Kiddush, for which I am very grateful, and made a condition that there has to be beef jerky. So that is our game plan. And Baruch Hashem, it's very exciting. And you should just know that the blot of Friday is the 25% mark of Shas. It's not an insignificant milestone. Daf Lamed Daled in Maseches Rosh Hashana is right when we break into the 25.039 or whatever the percentages are. Very, very, very fine number of 25%, a quarter of Shas. And that is unbelievable because most of this has been in a pandemic. And thank God we're back here as we are. But there was a long stretch where it wasn't quite like this. First over Zoom, and then me unmasked and all of you masked, and then me in front of some screen that did nothing at all, but we did it anyways. Thank God we're making some strides. Let's actually try to finish our daf tonight. We're 2/3 of the way down. Last of the short lines on Daf Kav Ches and Beis. The Gemara says Umenat Timra. How do we know that this is true? How do we know that what is true? Well, we had just posited at the end of shiur yesterday that the Isser of Baal Tosif, there is a prohibition in the Torah of adding to a particular mitzvah. So the classic example that's given is if you cut your tzitzis in a way where you have another couple of corners. So that could be an Isser D'Oraisa of Baal Tosif. So the Gemara said, well, maybe we should assume, therefore, that sleeping in a sukkah on the 8th day is Baal Tosif. And the Gemara said in the name of Rava, no, it's only bismano. Only when you do something bismano, not outside of its time frame. Literally today, I took down my schach. So what if I slept out there? What if I sat? No, that's not the Isser of Baal Tosif. That's called laziness. And that should have been taken down a month ago or whatever month it is. It's a long time ago. But it rained, excuses, fine. So it says the Gemara, Umenat Timra, how do we know that Baal Tosif is linked to a Zman, that it's linked to its own time? Says the Gemara, Ditznan. This is a bit of a lengthy exposition, but the Gemara says as follows. Hanisnan b'matana achas, shenis arbu b'nisnan b'matana achas. Let's say that you have a korban that requires 1 sprinkling, and it gets mixed with another korban that requires 1 sprinkling. Yinasnan b'matana achas. So they're all mixed. You just do 1 sprinkling to be yotzei for each of them. The 1 counts for both. Good. We assume that all the blood is mixed. Matan daled b'matan daled. If you have a korban that requires 4 sprinklings and it's mixed with a korban that also requires 4 sprinklings, easy solution. Yinostim b'matan daled. Then do 4 sprinklings. The blood is mixed. It counts for both korbanos. What do we do, however? And here we'll see a big machlokas in the Tanaim when it's matan daled b'matan achas. One of the animals that I need to bring requires 4 sprinklings, and one of them, in this case, the animal of a bechor, and we'll see why this is relevant momentarily, and the animal that's a bechor only requires 1 sprinkling. So that's a machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yinasnu b'matan daled. He says you should overshoot. Better to overshoot than to undershoot, and therefore he says you should do 4 sprinklings. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, nope, Yinasnu b'matan achas. Rabbi Yeshua holds the line. He says, no, we follow the smaller number. Now, logically speaking, what's the big deal? Like, just do 4. Like what? Okay, so some of the blood belongs to the animal that's 4. What's the problem? So Amar lo Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar says to Rabbi Yeshua, Harehu over B'Bal Tigra. You're not allowed to do less than the Torah commands. With the first animal that required a sprinkling of 4, you're only doing 1. In which case, that's Bal Tigra. You've reduced whatever the Torah commanded of you. That's not allowed. Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua. That's a terrible argument because Harehu over al Bal Tosef. But if you do 4, then the part of the blood that belongs to the bechor, so then that's Baal Tosef. You did 4 sprinklings instead of 1. So says the Gemara, Amar le Rebbe Lazar, lo nemar Baal Tosef el kshu ba'atzmo. We only say Baal Tosef, he says back to Rabbi Yeshua, in a vacuum. But when there's multiple forces at play, in this case, for example, we have 2 korbanos that have their blood mixed up, one of 4 sprinklings and 1 of 1. We don't say Bal Tosif in such a case. And Rabbi Yeshua says back to him, Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua, Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua, no, lo nemar Bal Tigra. I could argue the same exact thing, Bal Tosif and Bal Tigra, the same pasuk. So maybe we should assume that there too, that it's only in a vacuum, that and therefore no one should have any real good reason to argue with one another. Says the Gemara, and here's where things get a little different. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, I, who am of the opinion that you should only give 1 sprinkling of blood when the blood of an animal that requires 4 sprinklings and the blood of an animal that requires 1 are mixed. I only say 1. Kshalona sata, when you don't overdo it, when you only do 1. So you're right that avarta al bal tigra, that maybe it's possible that you violated the Isra of bal tigra of reducing the way that a mitzvah should be performed. However, velo asisa ma'isa biyadecha. But you didn't actually do anything. It was a passive prohibition. Mashe enken kshanosata. When you overshoot, and one of your animals is a bechor that only requires 1 set of sprinkling, and the other animal is a 4, but you don't want to overshoot. When you do overshoot, then avarta al bal tosif ve'asisa ma'isa biyadecha. This is the distinction that we would call shei ve'al taseh versus kum ve'aseh. So Rabbi Yeshua takes a different angle. He's like, even if you're right that only doing 1 is bal tigra, but at least it was done b'shei ve'al taseh. You have to do something. You have the mixed blood of an animal that requires 4 sprinklings and an animal that requires 1. Which one's better? Do we do the 1 or do we do the 4? Rabbi Yeshua says, let's do the 1, because in the event that it really is bal tigra, fine, at least it was b'shei ve'al taseh and not b'kum ve'aseh. It was passive. I did 1 sprinkling and then I stopped. Says the Torah, where are the other 3? In a chanami. That's possible. But I need it to be b'shei ve'al taseh in a passive form and not b'kum ve'aseh, not to actively violate the prohibition. Now, all of this is the brisa. Then says the Gemara as follows. When we bring that first spritz, haven't we already been yotzei for the bechor? Aren't we done now with the bechor? Hasn't its zman passed? We see that time has now passed, that the mitzvah of the bechor was done. Yet the katani da'avar mishum bal tosif. So therefore, we see that that there could still be an isser of bal tosif. Maybe we should say lav mishum de'amrinan, isn't it? Because we would say in regards to a bechor that kevan de'ilu misrame le buchra acharina hadar mazemine, that had it been that another bechor was brought, that the kohen would in fact do that sprinkling. Therefore, kula yom zmane, the entire day is the zman. Now, if we interpret the brisa this way, that even after the first sprinkling, which should have been sufficient for a bechor, we're still concerned about bal tosif. And the reason why we say that we're still concerned about bal tosif is because maybe another bechor will be brought and the kohen will have to sprinkle again. That was our question that we started with. I said it was a long-winded exposition, and in fact it is. We had asked our question, Umana Timra, how do we know that there's a link between Bal Tosif and the Iker Zman of a particular Isser? And this is the answer. The answer is from the Brisa of Bechor. Says the Gemara Mimai. How do you know that's true? We're 10, 11 lines from the bottom of Kaf Chesed base. How do you know that that's true? Dilma, perhaps, Kasava Rabbi Yoshua, that maybe Rabbi Yoshua holds very differently than we assumed yesterday. Maybe he holds that mitzvos over alein afilu shelo bizmanan. Maybe he holds that the isser of Bal Tosif applies even outside of the time frame of a particular isser. We don't have to hold that way. That was just what Rava had said on the previous Amud, and we were within that assumption. So says the Gemara, you misunderstood the whole argument. Why are we talking about the Brisa about Bechor? Anan, says the Gemara, Hachi Ka'amrinan. You're right. Really, what we're talking about is something different. We're trying to figure out a complexity in the Gemara. Rav Shemin bar Abba was one of the people who answered a question above. So above, we had asked a question. Rava had told us about this idea that Bal Tosif only happens during a particular Zman. Abaye says, how do you know? And then we gave the answer from a and then Abaye says, what about Hayashin b'shmini b'sukkah? What about someone who sleeps in the sukkah yilakeh? And then Rava had answered that no, it's only bismanan. And Rav Shemin asked a question from the Kohanim to Duchen. Remember, we said the Kohanim to Duchen, and they wanted to add their own bracha. The Brisa says you're not allowed. So let's go back to where we are, 10 lines from the bottom. Anan hachi ka'amrinan. This is really the question that we're bothered by. Rav Shemin bar Abba, my taima shavik masnisan umosiv mi Brisa. Why is it that he left the Mishnah that I just brought about Bechor, And he asked this question from a brisa, which spoke about Birchas Kohanim. Yesterday's sample by Rav Shemin Bar Abba spoke about Birchas Kohanim, and that there was a Kohen who wanted to add a bracha. We said he's not allowed to add a bracha because the whole day is fit for him to be giving a korban, fit for him to be giving a bracha. Boi, says the Gemara, Losiv mimas nisin. He should have asked from the Mishnah. Why? Because a Mishnah is always a better source, a more powerful source than a brisa. Mas nisin my time lo mosiv. What's the reason why Rav Shemin Bar Abba didn't give the approach of the Mishnah, which the Mishnah was discussing the case of the Bechor? Why did he pick the case of Birchas Kohanim? Kevan te'ilu misrami lebuchra charina. Because had it been that there was another Bechor, he would have had to do another hazah. Therefore, kula yom azmanehu brisa nami. The same is true by a brisa as well, by the brisa that discusses the case of the Birchas Kohanim. Kevan di misrami tzibura acharina. That had it been that there was another tzibur hadar mevarech kula yom azmane. So really, there's no difference, and that's really what the Gemara was bothered by. Why didn't Rav Shemin Bar Abba ask from the stronger of the two sources? Rav Shemin Bar Abba hasam lo sagi le'delo yai. Rav Shemin Bar Abba makes a distinction and tells us why is it that we tried to bring a proof from the world of the brisa instead of the world of the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Hasam, in regards to the Bechor, lo sagi de lo yahiv, there is no circumstance in which that Kohen, for whom it's his shift, it's his mishmar, that he would not bring the korban. But here, when it comes to the Birchas Kohanim, he's not the only Kohen. That's different. That's not shift. Anyone can do the Birchas Kohanim. Anyone can go up on the Duchan. So under those circumstances, he can get out of it. So that was why the Gemara was bringing this whole Umanat Timra, this whole case about the bloods that were mixed and the Bechor, was because that case is a stronger case than the case of the Brisa. Then says the Gemara, going back to the whole sugya about Abaye and Rava. So it says the Gemara, Rava Amar, let's say, lo bay kavana. This is an interesting distinction. When it comes to being yotze in mitzvah, so then lo bay kavana. It could be an accident, you can be yotze. However, la'avor, but to violate the Isser of Baal Tosef, then bay kavana. Great distinction. Okay, says the Gemara, hold on one second. That's not necessarily true about the Baal Tosef. V'amatan damim Rabbi Yossi, when it comes to the matan damim of Rabbi Yossi, what is Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Yoshua holds that one sprinkling is enough. To lavor velo bay kavana, you'll still violate the Isser even without kavana. The Bechor is done with right now. You're sprinkling for the other animal. We still say that you're over it. So therefore, the Gemara kind of slightly changes its answer, 2 lines from the bottom, and then we'll jump into a connected sugya. Elo amar Rava. Let's say lo bay kavana, like we said, that when it comes to being yotze a mitzvah, lo bay kavana, you don't need to have kavana to fulfill a mitzvah. But when it comes to the Isra of Baal Tosef, that depends. Bismano lo bay kavana, in its right time. If it's during that time you're violating the Isra Baal Tosef, then you're right, lo bay kavana. But shelo bismano, if it's out of its normal time, then bay kavana. Otherwise, you would not be yotze, and that is how Rava closes out this sugya. Just to speak halacha l'maisa just for a moment, when it comes to mitzvos deoraisa, we assume in Shulchan Aruch that one is obligated to have kavana. So let's say, for example, a person's putting on their tefillin in the morning and they're 80% out cold. They're putting on their tefillin, but they're doing it like a robot. So we typically assume that when a person's putting on their tefillin, they know what they're doing. Okay, it's mitzvos hanashim elumada. I understand. So yes, it's true. It's better, of course. It's a higher level of mitzvos tzrichos kavana to stop and pause and say, I'm doing this for a reason. I'm doing this because the Kodesh Baruch Hu asked me to do it. That's the right way to do it. When it comes to dinei derabanan, we paskin mitzvos ein tzrichos kavana. And therefore, if you're washing the tilas yadayim for bread, and that's a mitzvah derabanan, and someone is hawking you and telling you a vort that you're trying to not listen to, it doesn't matter. You're still yotze in the tilas yadayim. You can still make a bracha on that because that's a din derabanan. Let's get into another sugya. Last line of Kav Chesam at Beis, really where today's daf should have started. Just goes to show you how much later we would have been yesterday. Another 14 minutes. That would have been bad. Amar le Reb Zera l'shame. He says to his servant, Ichvun v'takali. I want you to have kavana and blow shofar so I can be yotze. Top line of Chav Testament Aleph. So Alma, what does that show us about the sheet of Reb Zera? That shows us that Alma kasavar mashmiya by kavana, that the person blowing the shofar has to have kavana. He can't just be practicing, right? He has to have kavana to be motzi other people. Meisvei, hold on one second. That's not true. Haya over achore beis hakneses, so shahaya beiso samach lebeis hakneses. A person's walking behind a shul, or their house is close enough to shul. And then Vishama kol shofar or kol Megillah. He hears the sound of the shofar, or he hears a person laning Megillah. So what do we do under those circumstances? What about the shomeya, not the mashmiya? What about the shomeya? The shomeya has to have in mind. Who cares what his feelings are, even if he's not paying attention? The mashmiya wasn't thinking about him. Who was the mashmiya thinking about? The people in the room, or maybe not even that. So it says the Gemara, that's not true. That's not true. When a person is a shliach tzibur, they have a totally different brain. And their brain is not just thinking about the people in the room. They're thinking very broadly. The daite akule alma. The intent of a shliach tzibur is that anyone who hears me can be yotze. That's always going to be the mindset of a Baal Tokea. And therefore, it's true that this brisa doesn't reference the specific mindset of the shliach tzibur, of the Baal Tokea, but it doesn't matter because the shliach tzibur is always going to be that way. Toshma, let's try to question this idea again about the mashmiya, that he has to have kavanah. Niskavin shomea v'lo niskavin mashmiya. We saw the sugya once already, that if the person listening, trying to be yotze, has in mind, but the mashmiya doesn't have in mind, or niskavin mashmiya v'lo niskavin shomea, the more likely case is the mashmiya has you in mind, but you're spaced out reading a book. Lo niskavin shomea, lo yatsa achi iskavin shomea umashmiya. We need both of them to be on the same page. And then the brisa says, Katani, the brisa seems to say that mashmiya dumya de shomea, that the person who is the mashmiya, the one making the sounds, the Baal Tokea, has to be the same as the shomea in that mashomea shomea la'atzmo, af mashmiya la'atzmo. They have to have a minimum amount of intent that they want to be yotze for themselves. So says the Gemara, the katani lo, and we see here that if that's the case, the katani lo yotze, that you're not going to be yotze. He has to be thinking not only about himself, but he has to be thinking about others. Yet, and we have to see how this fits in with the shita of Reb Zeir that we started with in the sugya. So the Gemara says, you're right. When it comes to the mashmiya, to the Baal Tokea, it's a machlokes tanoim. Says the Gemara, 10, 12 lines down or so, 12 lines or so, tanoihi. It's actually a machlokes tanoim. The Tanya and this shita, this brisa will bring us to the new Mishnah, which seems to be totally out of left field. The Tanya, the brisa writes, Shomea la'atzmo umashmiya lefi darko. Right, that's everyone is thinking about themselves. Amar Rav Yossi, but medvar mamurim. That's only true that you can be yotze that way. B'shliach tzibur, when the mindset of the person is very grand. Akule alma was the language of the Gemara before. But if it's not that way, aval b'yachid, if a person is just thinking about themselves, narcissism, I just want to be yotze myself. Lo yotzat she'es kaven shomea mashmiya. Now, obviously, the highest level in which to do this is for a person to be totally dedicated and paying attention. The person who's the Baal Tokea makes the announcement, I'm going to have all of you in mind. You should have yourselves in mind. Don't say Baruch Hu V'Rosh Shemo to the brachas, all the normal announcements that we're used to. And that is, of course, ideal. What the Gemara is trying to push at is where's the line? And this is a very difficult thing to say. What is considered, I have intention to listen? Both on the Baal Tokea side and on the Shomea side. We can avoid all the shilas by doing what's right and paying attention. But these are shilas and poskim as to what is considered.
Someone who's behind a shul that didn't hear the brachas and just hears the.
I mean, the brachos are not ma'akev. We don't care. The brachos don't change anything. If you don't make the brachos, but you hear the shofar, you're still yotze. The brachos are derabanan. That's almost all brachos are derabanan, with the exception of birchos haTorah and birchos hamazon. So if a person doesn't hear the brachos of shofar, but they hear the whole shofar and they're sitting, their eyes closed, all the kavanas of the arizal, you're yotze. In fact, you would only be allowed to make brachos again, and we're going to learn this sugya today, if you're being motzi somebody else for a mitzvah. Otherwise, you're done. You can't go back and make the brachos, because once the mitzvah is done, you're done. What are you going to do? So there are some rare exceptions, like by tzitzis and by talis and tefillin. Like if you forget to make a bracha, so you like move your tefillin around and make a new bracha, and you see them in makoma and you like move down, fine. You can find a way to do it. But typically speaking, lulav and esrog, you're done. you pick up the esrog upside down and then you're done. So, or the right way, then you're done. So that's what the Gemara says, that we have to try and really have appropriate intentions. Third of the way down at the new Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, what is going on here? Famous pasuk that when Moshe's arms were held up by the people around him, all of a sudden he's a crystal ball. Whatever happens with his hand. So then why are we put his hands down ever? Just pick them up all the way. We'll win all the wars. As long as the Jews were looking upwards. And they commit their hearts to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then says the Gemara, Hayu Mizgabrin, then they would win. V'im lav Hayu Noflin, and if not, they would lose. Kayotze Badavar, we have a very similar type of phraseology in a different pasuk in Chumash. Ata Omer Asei Lecha Sraf V'simo So Al Nes V'aya Kol Hanashuch V'ra'o So B'chai. This was an unfortunate story for the Jews, and people were dying from a magefa. They were bitten by snakes, and then they made a sraf. They made this little stick with a snake on top, and anyone who saw it would live. Nochash Memi, so Nochash Mechaya. Who's in charge? The snake's not in charge. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge. So obviously, what does the pasuk mean? It's teaching us something as an aside. Same language. When the Jews are looking heavenward, and people are focusing their hearts on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hayu Misrapin, they would be healed. And if not, they would be killed. Okay. Then the Gemara gets back to halacha. A very unique interjection as to why this is brought here. And if you look in Rashi here doesn't even talk about it. Rashi in the Mishnah doesn't talk about it at all. So then the end of the Mishnah gets back to halacha. Chereshot v'katan. We know chereshot v'katan are the categories of people who have no halachic das. They are considered a zero in halacha as it relates to das. That doesn't mean that they aren't bright. They might be very bright. They might be well beyond their years. There are a lot of mechabre svarim. I mean, the Chef Shmaitza finished the Sefer by 17. He wasn't smart when he was 13. He was a genius, off the charts. But halachically, he has no das. It has nothing to do with how smart you are. This isn't an IQ test. It's a halachic assertion that until you're a bar chiyuva, you have no das. And a cheresh, someone who is a deaf mute, or a shota, someone who is not in charge of their mental faculties, which has a billion definitions, and it's very difficult to translate in halachic terms. So then under all those circumstances, ein motziin es harabim yedei chovasan. We do not rely on a chereshot v'katan to be yotze anything. We're going to get into some details here in the Gemara in a moment, but the Mishnah concludes, zehaklal, kol she'einu mechuyav badavar, einu motzi es harabim yedei chovasan. You have to be on a level playing field. The concept of arvus would indicate that as long as I am a bar chiyuva, and you are a bar chiyuva, no problem. I've shared this story before that I was at a dear friend's house in New York for Shabbos, and the head of the table said, would anybody like to make kiddush? And the young 20-year-old woman raised her hand and said, I would, Friday night. She took a cup, vaychulu hashamayim v'aretz, midoraisa, no problem at all. Men and women, I mean, it might possibly a shaila of kol isha, though the poskim write that by shiros v'sishpachos, the status of kol isha might be a little different. We're not lenient on these things. The scenario was a unique one. It's the only time in my life I've ever been in such a circumstance. But halacha l'maisa, that kiddush works perfectly fine because that woman and me had the same halachic obligation, which is that kiddush on Friday night is a mitzvah d'oraisa for both of us. So just like a woman is mechuyeves and all the isurim of Shabbos, she also has a mitzvah saseh of saying kiddush on Friday night. So as long as the level field is the playing field is level, you're good. But if you're a katan, chereshot of a katan, so then it doesn't work. Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa halfway down gives us a lot more color in regards to the mitzvah of tkiyas shofar. Says the Gemara as it opens. Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa writes, this is in fact a tosefta and not a Brisa. Hakol chayavim b'tkiyas shofar. Everyone is obligated in tkiyas shofar, and then the Gemara goes on to list things that are seemingly obvious. Kohanim v'levim v'Yisraelim. Gerim, converts, ve'avadim meshuchrarim, freed slaves, ve'tumtum. A tumtum is a person who we cannot identify their reproductive organs. It's unclear as to what gender the child is. Androgynous is a child who is presenting with both genitalia. Umishachetzio eved v'chetzio ben chorin, someone who is only half eved and half ben chorin. That can only happen in a case where the person is owned by two others and one person frees their 50% portion of a slave. Continues and that's the end of the list. It says the Gemara, tumtum, when it comes to a tumtum, this person for whom we're not able to identify its gender because there's skin covering over all of the anatomy, there's no protrusion of the male anatomy, and we have no idea. Man, these are real cases. This happened to someone I know. I think I told this story too, that Mazel Tov, I had a granddaughter. And then the next email went out, the bris is going to be next Tuesday. because they couldn't see what they thought was supposed to be the case. So they usually do ultrasounds and they just see what's going on underneath and see what the organ structure is. Are there ovaries? Are there testicles? It's not so hard to determine. But when at Lefum Riata, right away, when you look, it's very difficult to tell when babies are built in certain circumstances. So a tumtum, a person who has neither anatomy showing in a clear way, Eno motzi lo esmino velo es she'eno mino. He can't be motzi even other tumtumin. That's not allowed. Androgynous, motzi esmino. Avalo es she'eno mino. An androgynous who's showing both anatomies, so he can be motzi other people who are androgynous, but he cannot be motzi anyone else. Mishachetzio eved b'chetzio ben chor, and this person who's half eved and half freed, eno motzi lo esmino velo es she'eno mino. Him too, he is very limited. He can't. He can only take care of himself. Omar Mar, Hakol Chayavim B'Tkiya Shofar Kohanim Levim B'Yisraelim. Come on, that's like Captain Obvious material. So says the Gemara Pshita, that's everybody. Ihani lo mechayve. If these people are not going to be held accountable for the chiyuv of shofar, man mechayve. What other Jews are there? What are we talking about? Everybody else on the list was a complicated case. What about the regular people? What about all of us? Kohanim Levim and Yisraelim. So says the Gemara, you're actually right. It should be relatively obvious, but there is a unique havamina, one of two possible unique havaminas. Here's the first, Kohanim itzrichale. We need it for the case of Kohanim. Why? Salka daita chamina. I might have thought as follows: Hol v'ksiv yom lachem. That today is a day where you should hear the shofar. So man deleise elabet kia dechad yoma hu d'mechayev. That a person who only has one day a year when they hear shofar, they're the only ones who would be obligated in shofar. But v'hani kohanim, that's not the case. By kohanim, they have to hear horns all year round. Hol ve'isnehu b'tkios to kol Hashana. Every time they bring a korban, they have to hear the shofar. What does the pasuk say? So because every time they bring a korban, there's chatzosros. So havamina that the only people who would have been chayiv in Rosh Hashana by shofar are people who are not obligated in shofar year round. So therefore, maybe we would have thought that by the kohanim ema lo lechayvu, that maybe they should not be obligated in the mitzvah of shofar because Rosh Hashana is not the only day that they have. They have the chatzosros all year round. Kamash Malan. Wow, that is unbelievable. That maybe Kohanim, Avi, go take a walk, man. You are out and about on Rosh Hashanah. You're free to go. But then says the Gemara, terrible argument. Why? Because what type of horns were being blown by the Korbanos? Chatzotzros. So says the Gemara, me dummy, 12 lines from the bottom, 15 lines from the bottom. You're comparing the shofar of a ram or any other kosher animal, for the shofar of a ram for Rosh Hashanah to the chatzotzros, like a trumpet. What? Those two things are completely different. Not only that, the chatzotzros aren't even kosher for Rosh Hashanah, so you can't even put them in the same boat. Hasam chatzotzros, v'hacha shofar. By the korbanos, you're blowing. Yeah, it's totally not the same thing. How could you even compare the two? So says the Gemara, Ella, and this is a girsa change in the Gemara, and the Gemara says the Hagos V'Tzionim writes in Os Katan Dalet on the side, B'tfus Krakow, Nosaf Kohanim V'Levim. It should say like this. Ella Kohanim V'Levim Itzrich. We need it not for the Kohanim because of the argument above, but for Kohanim and Levim. Because Salka Daita Chamina, I might have thought as follows. Why would Kohanim and Levim be different? Because Ho Lutnan Shabeh Hayovel Rosh Hashanah L'Tkiya U'Lebrachos, that because Yovel, the Yom Kippur, Yovel is announced on Yom Kippur. So that Yom Kippur is similar to Rosh Hashanah in regards to Tkiya and Brachos. So maybe I would have said, Man de Iseh b'mitzvahs haYovel, that a person who has the regular rules of Yovel, Iseh b'mitzvah de Rosh Hashanah, then they're the ones who have the specific mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, which is shofar. But V'hani Kohanim V'Levim, the added word there, V'hani Kohanim V'Levim, their rules by Yovel are not the same. They have different standards. Why? Because their rules are different by Yovel. How are the rules different by Yovel? Because it's not last of the short lines on Daf Chav Testament Aleph, 10 lines from the bottom. Because what does the Mishnah write? Kohanim v'Levim mochrin la'olam v'go'alin la'olam. They're allowed to sell. They're allowed to buy. Everything is fine. Even during the Shemitah year, they're allowed to do that. During Yovel, no problem. So because they have a unique set of halachos that are different than the regular Yisraelim, Ema, I would have said b'mitzvah de Rosh Hashanah lo lechayvu, that because we compare Yom Kippur to Rosh Hashanah by Yovel, so then maybe we should have said that only people whose rules of Yovel are appropriately normal, and that excludes Kohanim and Levim. Ka mashmalan, that's not correct. That really even Kohanim are required. What the Gemara doesn't speak about is why the word Yisrael was included in the list. You can give me an argument about Kohanim and maybe an argument about Kohanim and Levim, but the Gemara does not deal with why Yisrael was left in the Brisa. That should be obvious. And I have no idea why it was included.
Because if you exclude it, it would.
Well, I said, why?
And you exclude Israel, it would certainly raise a question.
It could be rephrased. Forget about the exact word.
You're saying to phrase it in the negative, that these people aren't not up, whatever.
Everybody is including Kohanim and Levim. It
Could have been. I think my question is stronger than that answer, but I'm not sure. I didn't look into this. These are things that just hit me as I'm learning, like, I don't understand. The Gemara should have taken it all the way. What about Yisraelim? Maybe there's an exclusion for 5 other reasons. I don't know. Okay, 2 dots, 8 lines from the bottom. First of the middle width lines, Misha Chetzio Eved V'Chetzio Ben Chorin. We said that a person who is half owned and half freed, Eino Motzi Lo Esmino, he cannot be Motzi other people, V'Lo She'eino Mino, and certainly not others who are different than he is. Amar Rav Huna Ula Atzmo Motzi, but he is allowed to be Motzi himself. He's 50-50. He's half Jew and half Evet. So what should he do? So according to Rav Huna, he can be Motzi himself. Amar Le Rav Nachman, the Rav Huna, absolutely not. Why did we say that when it came to other people, that he was not allowed to be motzi those other people who are like him, who are the same min? Because you can't separate from that person the half of him which is an eved from the half of him which is a ben chorin. And if that's true, you have a mechanical problem. 50% of the cells in his body are eved, and 50% of the cells in his body are ben chorin. You're going to hold up a cup, and what are you going to do? You're going to say shofar? You're going to say kiddush? No, you're not a yid. You're 50% a yid. No, you can't be motzi other people because of this concern. What about you? You're the same problem. It's a great question. So says the Gemara, you're right. 3 lines from the bottom. Elo Amar Rav Nachman, afla atzmo eino motzi. Unbelievable. You can never do anything that's a mitzvah on your own. You can only be yotzei mitzvos through others who have a pure chiyuv. You're stuck. You're like trapped in the twilight zone because you're half and half. Tanya Namiachi, the Brisa writes, in fact, the Brisa supports this, that if you're half and half, that you are not able to be motzi yourself. Changing gears a little bit, 2 lines from the bottom, Tani, Ava Berei de Rav Zera, great first name. He says, Kol brachos kulan afal pi sheyatza motzi, that any bracha that you make, even though you were yotze, you can be motzi others. Chutz mi birchas halechem ubirchas hayayin, except for hamotzi and for borei priya gafen. Rashi, 6 lines from the bottom, expands this. Rashi dibur maskal chutz mi birchas halechem hayayin ushar birchas peiros v'reichani she'enan chova. It's not that there's any chova to eat. Ela she'asar lehanos min olam zebel bracha. Oh. Ubezu, key language for the Rishonim and for Lamdas. Ubezu, ein kan arvus, she'ein achova al ha'adam lo lishane v'lo livrich. Beautiful language of Rashi to give us the meat and potatoes of a sugya that we have no time to learn, which is that arvus only applies when there's a chiyuv. I can help you with making kiddush. I can help you with making shofar, and I can say Baruch Atah Hashem as many times as is needed. But I already made a shahakol on my cold drink here. You're laryngitic. Phil, can you make a bracha? Sorry, can't help you. The only time arvus applies between me and you is when there's a chiyuv shabo. But making a bracha is not a chiyuv. It's to avoid the iser shabo. So that's the lumdus that Rashi gives, a beautiful, short lumdus that Rashi gives, so stunning in his conciseness that he's able to encapsulate so much. But that is how Arvus works. Arvus isn't this lovey-dovey, everything goes kind of a thing. It's rigid. It has a format. It has rules. I can only help you fulfill a chiyuv. But to avoid the isser of achila without a bracha, that's on you. I can't make another bracha because of you. Had I not made one yet, no problem. I can make a bracha shakal for all of you. That's fine. But once I make my bracha, we are done for. Good. So says the Gemara in the name of Ahava Brei the Rav Zera that I can be motzi anyone, just not by birchos lechem or birchos yain, and by all other brachos. Sheim lo yatza motzi, v'im yatza eino motzi. That had it been that you were not yotze with your shahakol, then I could be motzi you. But im yatza, if I was already yotze with my shahakol, then eino motzi, then I can't help you. So says the Gemara, boy Rava, as we turn to the top of Chavtes and Beis. Looks like we're going to be going to the finish line here. Sorry. Birchas halechem shel matzah. Ubirchas hayayin shel kiddush hayom mahu. I was a little presumptuous in my over talking because the Gemara says we know that the mitzvah deoraisa is matzah. What about the hamotzi? Can I make the hamotzi for you again, or should I just say asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'sivanu ala achilas matzah instead of hamotzi lechem min haaretz? There are options. So what should I do? And the same thing for Kiddush Hayom. So I have to say another Borei Pri Hagafen. Do we say Kevan dechovahu mapik? Do we say that because there is a mitzvah d'oraisa, granted the bracha is only derabanan, but because there's a mitzvah, then therefore I can repeat the component of that mitzvah, which is really a birchas hanehnin, just a shehakol, or just, well, not a shehakol, but just a hamotzi, or just a Borei Pri Hagafen. O dilma bracha alav chovahi. Great question. Great question. Really putting the test to how powerful is the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen under the chuppah. How powerful is the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen when I'm making kiddush for you? I've already had a l'chaim. I'm going to make another shehakol on another l'chaim just because of you. So how far does it go? So it says the Gemara, Tashma, the Amar Abashi ki havein be Rav Papi, when he was looking at and watching Rav Papi have a mekadesh lan. He did it. That's how we paskin. This is quoted in Shulchan Aruch. If you look on the side in the Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, this is quoted in Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim Kuf Samach Zayin Seif Kaf, and in Hilchos Kiddush in Reisha and Gimel Seif Daled. This is the din that you are allowed to say Kiddush as many times as is needed for others to hear Kiddush. No problem at all. Continuing 5 lines down, B'chi Hava Asi Arise Midabra, when they would come in, when his arise, when his workers, his farmers would come in from the field, have a mekadesh. He would also make kiddush for them. Tana Rabbanan Abraisa. Lo yifros adam prusa le'orachin. You can't set a table for guests unless you're making the meal with them. The assumption at the time is the balabais would make all the brachos, but if you already ate, you should not be doing that. However, you are allowed to set the table and you are allowed to make brachos in order to be machanech your children in mitzvos, and then just closes out the Gemara v'halalu v'megillah afal pi sheyatza motzi. When it comes to halal and Megillah, you can repeat it for other people. I just wanted to highlight one halacha that is halacha l'maisa, that for those who are around young children, either as an educator or as a parent, you can make brachos on their behalf even if you are not eating. That's what the Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Kuf Samach Zayin Seif Yud Tes. Misha eno ochel, eno yachal levarach birchas hamotzi lahotzi haochlin. That we know. That's what we saw. That a person who is not eating cannot just make a random bracha. Aval liktanim yachal levarach. You're allowed to make a bracha for those people. And we had a frum babysitter who did this with my tiny little kids when they were too young to speak. That is the din. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah says, that also, even if they're not even at the age of chinuch, just to make sure that it's shagur b'fi, baruch atah Hashem, great, make the bracha. If it's possible for you to eat a food, could you? Yeah, I guess so. But that's not the din necessarily. The din is that you're allowed to do it. That brings us to the end of the parak. Hadron Allah Ru'u Bezin Yiratzon. We should come back to this daf in 7.5 years. Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashana Shechalios B'Shabbos. Famous sugya. What happens when Rosh Hashana coincides with Shabbos? The Mikdash Hayu Token Abal Lo B'Medina. They would blow shofar in the base of Mikdash. We know Shvus B'Mikdash is mutter. And Nisr D'Rabbanan in the base of Mikdash was removed because Kohanim was reasoning and a whole host of other reasons for that exclusion of Alob Medina. However, the way we paskin is that we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. That falls out on Rosh Hashanah. Now, Mishachara Beis Hamikdash, very uniquely, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Shiu Token B'chol Makom Sheyesh Bo Bezdin. He said, I'm going to change things up a little bit. That even though it's true that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and even when the Beis Hamikdash was around, the Medina it wasn't allowed. However, he says, I'm allowing one thing, that whenever there is a Bezdin, I'm allowing people to be Tokeya on Shabbos, which is Rosh Hashanah, even after the Churban. It was such big shoulders. It's an unbelievable psak to say that. Because the Mishnah said a line ago that B'Medina, even B'Binyano, it was Aser. And he was being Mekel B'Chorbano as long as there was a Bezdin. Amar Rabbi Lazar lo hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai al b'Yavne bilvad. He said that he only made one exception. It wasn't across the boards. It was only in Yavne. Says the Gemara, you don't know what you're talking about. Amru lo, they. We don't know who the they are. It seems to be other Tanaim. The Gemara is going to ask about this. Amrlo, they said to him, Echad Yavne ve'echad kol makom sheyesh bo bezdin. Anywhere where there was a bezdin, good to go. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a mekel, and Rosh Hashanah shechalios b'Shabbos, one could be tokeya even b'chorbano. Obviously, we don't paskin this way because otherwise we'd all go run to the Aguda Bezdin or the CRC, and we would all hear shofar. The Od Zos Haisi Yerushalayim Yisera al Yavne. This was one of the great differences between Yerushalayim and Yavne. Shekol Ir Shehi Roa V'Shamas V'Kroba V'Yichol Lavo token. Any place that was able to see Yerushalayim was able to be tokea. U'B'Yavne Lo Hayu token El Bebezdin Bilbad. There was a kula in Yerushalayim to still be tokea as long as you were in eyesight of the mikdash. But in Yavne and in other places with the Bezdin, it had to be actually in the Bezdin. Where do we know this limitation from, that one is not allowed to blow shofar on Rosh Hashana when it falls out on Shabbos? Amar Levi bar Lachma, Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. Kasav echad omer Shabbason zichron trua. On Shabbos, it should just be a remembrance. But Kasav echad omer Yom trua yelachem. It should actually be a day of hearing the shofar. Lokasha kam Yom Tov shechal yos b'Shabbos. When Shabbos coincides with Yom Tov, it's not allowed. Kam Yom Tov shechal yos b'chol. One is allowed, one is not allowed. What does that imply? That implies that there's an Isser Daraisa to be Tokea b'shofar because it's two psukim. And the way that we split the psukim is that the one that says that it's Shabbason Zichron, that implies that it's an Isser Daraisa to blow shofar. Says the Gemara, Marova imi Daraisa hi. If what you're saying is that it's really an Isser Daraisa to blow shofar, then how did our Mishnah say that it's mutter to blow shofar? But Mikdash Heichi Takinon. That doesn't work. Our Mishnah said that you're allowed to blow the shofar in the Mikdash. If it's a pasuk in Chumash, we're not lenient on psukim and Chumash in the Beis HaMikdash. We're only lenient on shvusim on dine derabanan. So there's no possible way that makes sense. And furthermore, halav melacha ute. Blowing shofar is not even something that warrants a pasuk. What are you doing? You're using an instrument. Ditana debei Shmuel. Kol melechas avoda lo sasu. You're not allowed to do melacha. Yotzes atkiya shofar dias abashi chachma bein melacha. Blowing the shofar is what's called a chachma. It's a wisdom. It's a complex thing, but it's not a melacha proper. It's an isser derabanan. It can't be that it's an isser deraisa, and therefore we are brought to a second answer, a more famous answer, the one that we know of, which is 2/3 of the way down, a little bit more, 3/4 of the way down, 5 lines before the wide lines. Midoraisa blowing shofar is absolutely mutter. The Rabbanan who the gazer ba, it's only an isser derabanan. Kiderabba, just like Rabba. The Amar Rabba, hakol chayav b'tchiyah shofar. Really, everyone's obligated to Tchiyah shofar, but not everyone's an expert. So we have a gzeira that when Shabbos falls out on Rosh Hashana that we don't blow shofar because gzeira shemei lena biyado v'yelech etzel abaki lelmod v'avirenu Abrahamos b'rshus harabbim. Is that a famous reason that we don't blow shofar? All the Rishonim are all over this. All the Achronim are all over this. How do we give up the mazel of the shofar against an Isser Derabanan of a gzeira that doesn't even apply in a place where we have an Eruv? Fine, not for now. Then says the Gemara, B'hainu time and Delula, B'hainu time and Megillah, that we expand these to other days as well. I am going to push them. I'm sorry, but if you look at the next blot, Daf Lamed is not short. So we're just going to push to the end of the page. Then we saw the big kula of Hiskin, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbi taught us that it was Shabbos day and it was the Rosh Hashana. So that's no big deal for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Everybody come to Bezdin. Everyone was coming around the Bezdin to hear what was going on. They wanted to hear shofar. Amar lahem, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Bnei Beseira Niska. No, blow the shofar. Come on, it's time. It's right before Musaf blow the shofar. Amr lo nidon. We have to sit and talk out the sugya. This is a bad time to talk out the sugya. You're in Musaf now. You got to blow the shofar. We're not talking. Amr len niska v'achar kach nidon. Stop it. I'm in charge. You guys blow the shofar. We'll worry about this later. La'achar shenisku. Fine, they listened to him because he was in charge. La'achar shenisku. Amr lo nidon. Yeah, they blew shofar, and then they said, "Okay, Rebbe, let's sit down and talk out the sugya." He's like, "We can't talk out the sugya." Amar lahem kfar nishma keren biyavna. People already heard the sound of a horn in Yavne. Ve'in meshivan la'achar ma'isa. A little manipulation. Go clean your room, and I'll give you no reward. Sorry, you're done. So what was going on here? He knew he was right. He had to get to the point of hearing shofar. There was no time to talk out the sugya, and that's what the Gemara says at these 2 dots. So just a drop more, and we'll stop at the end of the page. Amar Rabbi Lazar lo hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ela b'Yavne bilvad. Amar lo echad Yavne ve'echad kol makom sheyesh bo bezdin. So there's a strange machlokas in the Mishnah that according to Rabbi Lazar, and then no, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was only lenient in Yavne, and then the phrase of Amru lo that they said, it's not true. He was lenient. It was lenient everywhere. Amru lo, who are these people? Hainu Tanakama. It's the same exact shita. Sounds exactly the same. Why doesn't it just say Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Why did somebody else get brought into the Mishnah? We were fine. They agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Hainu Tanakama. Says the Gemara, and we'll conclude with this. Iko benayu beidina da'akroi. The nafkamina would be whether it's a bezdin that's like a pop-up bezdin, like the ones we have by Ataris Nadarim, or if it's a bezdin proper, like again, what the fixed ones that we have in town, the CRC, the Aguda. That would be the difference between them. With Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, I don't know. It's hard to know exactly which one would be which. We need Rashi for that one. Bezdin Akroi says Rashi 4 lines from the bottom. The Tanakama takinon, the Tana de Amru, the Tana de quote Amru lo sabar echad yavne ve'echad kol makom sheish bezdin kavua demit v'yavne. It has to be a bezdin that's kavua only. That's the sheet of Amru lo. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That's not the case. He was a little bit more expansive. We will stop right here. Pick up tomorrow night on the bottom of Chav Testament base for Daf Lamed. Wishing you all a beautiful night. For those of you who are not online before, we will be having our Siyum on Shabbos with a deluxe Kiddush. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
Actually, it's just a Kiddush on